questions?
No boss, no problem.
If anybody gets in the way, you know what to do.
Grand Theft Auto 3 was a red letter day not just for Rockstar Games, but for the entire video game industry. It was the first game that felt like it took place in a living, breathing world, because before GTA 3, Grand Theft Auto games looked like this.
It takes a very special blend of circumstances for a game like Grand Theft Auto 3 to come out, and that's what today's episode of Greatest Hits is all about. Most people assume that GTA is made in America, and thanks to Rockstar's global network of studios, that's now, in part, true. But the game about racing and chasing around US cities was originally created in the most unlikely of places, a post-industrial port town on Scotland's eastern coast. DMA Design was founded in Dundee in 1984 by a group of friends who met at a local computer club. Over the next 15 years, the studio created the Lemmings franchise, cult classics like Body Harvest and Space Station Silicon Valley, a Kirby title that never saw the light of day, and a couple of games about stealing cars you may have played.
There are a lot of games to cover here, so to do this, I'm going to have to spend couple of months reaching out to as many folks who worked at DMA Designs as possible, which is tricky because some of them have fallen off the face of the earth, others left the industry a long time ago and don't want to talk to some weird Irish guy, and more still work at Rockstar North. And if you know anything about Rockstar, it's that they're one of the most cagey when it comes to talking to the press.
So we're also going to be using our friends at the Video Game History Foundation to unearth some never-before-seen assets and concept art. And seeing as we're forced to do this whole thing remotely, we're hiring a video team in Scotland to go and film the other big character of this story, the city of Dundee.
So what's the point of this video? Well, aside from having just a fun, nostalgic romp about a bunch of old, classic games, I want to answer a question that's been bugging me for a really long time. A game like GTA doesn't just happen out of nowhere. So what was it about DMA Design and about Dundee and about that time and place that created one of the most important video games ever? And there's one more thing we need to cover in some respect. Whenever we talk about Grand Theft Auto or Rockstar North, there are certain names that sort of bubble to the surface. People like the Hauser brothers and Leslie Benzies. I want to know how influential these people were at the start and when they joined the story. And really, who are the names we don't know about? Who are the unsung heroes of the story of DMA and Grand Theft Auto? When did the story of DMA Design end, and when did the story of Rockstar North begin? All right, I have a lot of research to do and Scottish people to interview, and you have a lot of Celtic accents to listen to, so let's just roll the intro. It's the only reason any of you watch this show anyway.
DMA Design was founded in the Kingsway Amateur Computer Club in the Scottish city of Dundee. Dundee had been a successful seaport for centuries, and it was during the 18th century it found itself in the heart of the textile boom, supporting a network of jute mills which employed some 50,000 workers. But when the textile industry collapsed in the 20th century, it left tens of thousands of labourers out of work and desperate. The manufacturing industry that came in to fill that void would set the course for the city's future. It could have been anything: cars, sofas, washing machines. But 2 days before Christmas in 1946, it was the American watch manufacturer Timex that opened its first plant in Dundee. Crucially, in 1981, the plant took on a contract for Sinclair Research Limited, and suddenly the factory was producing computer systems for the UK market. So while in other towns it was cars, sofas, or washing machines falling out of the back of local delivery trucks, in Dundee, it was ZX Spectrums. So first things first, if I'm going to be able to tell the story of the early days of DMA Design, I need to talk to one of those four founders. And thankfully, through Twitter and emails and whatnot, I've convinced two of them to have a chat. Mike Daly
and Russell Kay.
I went to this computer club in Dundee. It was in the college. I think it was in a chemistry lab. And you've got to take your computer along, but also you had to take your TV with you. So it was the old CRTs that took on a couple of bus journeys to get there. So I met Steve, Russell and Dave at this club. And so him and Russell and that, we all kind of got together because we were really interested in this making stuff for computers, rather than everybody else at the club that was just swapping games and things. And I just kind of went from there. Russell and Dave were doing a game called Moonshadow on the Spectrum. Eventually came out as Zone Trooper. And for somebody coming in to see somebody actually making a game that's going to be a commercial game, it's like, ooh, they're doing stuff. Especially up in Scotland, there was no companies up here. So any kind of dev on it was interesting.
We all really wanted to work on the actual games, not just sit and play games, which is what half the people did at the club. I worked on the Spectrum, Mike did stuff on the Commodore 64 and Plus 4 and things like that. Dave actually worked at the Timex factory. He had the inside scoop on how things were actually put together and things like that. He left Timex. We took on a contract to convert a Commodore 64 game to Spectrum. That was taking a very long time, and Dave wasn't really interested in actually doing it. He wanted the new shiny. He bought an Amiga. That was when he came up with the idea of doing Menace.
Using his redundancy from Timex, Dave bought an Amiga 1000 and got to work on his first game, Menace, under the company name Acme Software. This was pure bedroom programming. Dave would code in his parents' house, while Mike went to Russell's house to code using a plank of wood balanced in a drawer as his desk. Dave eventually managed to sign a deal for Menace with famed Amiga publisher Psygnosis, and after the deal was signed, they changed the company name to DMA because a company in America was already using Acme.
That game got published, and he started getting some money for it. And at that point, he realized, that what's the point in staying at college doing all this stuff? I could go and make money on that. So he decided to give up college and start doing it full time. And he started on Blood Money, and he was getting kind of advances and stuff for that. So halfway through Blood Money, he decided we would start the office, and asked me if I wanted, if he was starting an office, do I want a job there? Oh, yes, please. What usually happened is myself and Russell would be doing ports, and Psygnosis would be paying Dave or DMA for these. Then he'd pay us, but me obviously salaried and Russell as a freelancer. And that would keep the office going while Dave looked at original work. That was the idea, is that the ports would keep the company going. So he just took anything on that Psygnosis had going.
As more work came in, they'd hire whoever seemed capable of doing it. Russell's mate Gary Timmons would hang around the studio playing with pixel art, and then Dave offered him a job. One of the reasons they did so much work for Psygnosis was that it was the closest publisher to Dundee, still about 4 hours across the border into England, down into Liverpool. By August of 1989, they had grown into this humble office sat above a baby shop. This is where Dave coded Blood Money with the help of remote graphic designer Tony Smith. This is where the growing team of game developers worked on ports, made tech demos, talked about other games, and bounced around ideas. David decided that his next game would focus on the AT-AT like walkers from Blood Money, and had animator Scott Johnson, recently hired from the local McDonald's, create some enemy sprites to walk around underneath the walkers. But Mike Daly thought that these 16x16 sprites weren't quite small enough, and so unlike the scale of Star Wars' AT-ATs, the walkers didn't look particularly tall and impressive. And so began a conversation about how small you could animate a sprite while retaining believable movement. While all this was going on, another creative problem was being solved. Russell was fawning over a particular gun from the game Salamander that traced along the bottom of the screen. This mishmash of conversations and ideas and problems would eventually lead to DMA's first greatest hit.
We've been having this argument that how many pixels do you actually need to make something that could move properly? And Mike wanted to prove that you could make them tiny. That there was a game on the Commodore 64 called Beachhead, and that had very small characters that had really nice animation. Other people had been arguing that Prince of Persia, where it had quite large characters that had really nice animation, that you couldn't get that animation in such a small number of characters. And Mike wanted to prove us wrong. The chap who did all the animation, Gary Timmons, he was always amazing to watch while he animated, because he would have a pixel for an arm and pixel for the other arm, and then the legs, and then the head, and he would animate these pixels to get them to just the way that he wanted them to walk. And he would spend hours and hours just moving this one pixel, and no, it's the wrong place. It needs to be there. There you go.
Okay, I edited this whole section not thinking I'd have to explain what Lemmings was, but I've just realized it's like a 30-year-old game. So here is the briefest explanation for the gameplay of Lemmings for all you young whippersnappers.
Basically, you start each level with a bunch of these little lads walking across the level. You have a bunch of jobs you can assign each lemming, and the idea is to dig, climb, and crawl your lemmings from that entrance to an exit somewhere else on the level. It was the biggest thing in gaming in 1991. Dundee even has this commemorative statue in a park just down the road from the boys' early office. And if you go to the shop underneath the office, there's a plaque saying that they made lemmings here.
Of course, none of this explains why they look like this. What is this thing? It's not a lemming. It's got like green hair and no mouth or nose and wearing blue overalls. Doesn't make any sense. So of course that was the first thing that came to mind. Why do they look like that? And this is a game made in the 90s, so naturally the answer was something ridiculous.
The colour of them, the green, white and blue, was to do with the EGA colour palette, because you had limited colours there. So on the Amiga there could have been anything. But doing it on the PC, there was this limited choice. So it was either green hair and blue dungarees or blue hair and green dungarees. And it was just decided that the blue dungarees and green hair was nicer.
And we all sat and talked about what the game could actually be and things like that. And I did the prototype because we decided that 10 lemmings wasn't enough. 20 wasn't going to cut it. We had to have 100. We just did things for fun, you know. That was kind of was pretty much just a lunchtime kind of. Oh, all right, I'll have a wee think about how we could do that. If we were going to make the lemmings follow the landscape, no, like I was saying, it's the salamander bullets that followed the landscape. How would you actually go about that? I'd had an idea how to actually go about that, and it took me a kind of few lunchtimes to kind of put a little prototype together, and then it took another few lunchtimes to actually work out how to draw 100 of them at once.
So I mean, Lemmings itself, Dave and Gary came up with the skills, and when we got them, that was the skills. It wasn't like it was, oh, that skill's not working, we'll take that, we'll do another one, or we'll do this. It just, I mean, that was what we got, and we worked around it. I think Lemmings took about 9 months or so. Once we started doing levels, we were getting like a 10 of a level that got into the game or something. Which, when you look back at how much it made, wasn't that much really. I think Dave managed to get a couple in, but they weren't particularly good ones. He kept making these levels thinking they'd be great, and we'd solve them in like 3 seconds, and then he'd go, well, that's not right, and then he'd go away and try and make them harder. Steve didn't get any levels in, they just didn't work very well. So it was really me, Scott and Gary that got all the levels done. And we all had really different approaches to doing them. I really like making big pictures and making you play through them. Whereas Gary ended up putting down like 3 blocks and then 1 skill, and you had to get out. They were really tricky. But we were all trying to beat each other with these levels and just make them as hard as possible.
My levels were never very good. You know, I'm better at writing the code than I am actually making things like that. It's when you do a PC game back then, you didn't just have one graphics card, and back then you didn't have anything like DirectX, so you weren't writing just one set of code. I had to write VGA, EGA, CGA, and each one quite different from each other. It wasn't a lot of common code that you could actually have. From day one, they were Lemmings. That was always the name.
And were they lemmings like you'd say, like, that's a lemming, that's the animal a lemming? Or
no.
Were they lemmings like the concept of a lemming, like a sheep?
They were the concept of the lemming. They were following each other no matter what happened, even to the point of death. And they were never meant to look like a lemming, the actual creature. In fact, I don't think we could have even told you what a real lemming looked like. No, as far as we were concerned, they were real lemming. They were a cultural reflection of ourselves. When we originally wanted to do we had the lemmings dressed up as Batman and Robin, and as the Addams Family, and as the Munsters and stuff like that. So a lot of what they've done with Lego and things like that was what we were thinking about in terms of lemmings. They were a no man that you could put everybody into.
In the weeks and months after its release, Lemmings steadily built an audience. It wasn't an overnight success, but as time passed, ports to other computers were demanded, and so DMA had to expand to meet it. The studio more than doubled in size, with some developers working on ports and others developing a sequel to Lemmings. But while the studio was larger, Dave Jones's business plan was still the same: have a solid backbone of porting and contract work that would pay for the development of original games. So in 1991, while they worked on Lemmings 2, DMA was using their newfound fame to score a contract with one of the biggest game companies in the world.
Up to about 95, because we started obviously doing Lemmings 2, we started doing like SNES stuff as well. I did the SNES version of Lemmings 2. But we also started getting interest from Nintendo for doing other things as well. We actually had Miyamoto up at the offices while we were doing that as well. Between 92 and 95, we did Lemmings 2 on a few platforms. We did Uniracers on the SNES. We did start doing a Kid Kirby game, but it just didn't finish anything. So that ended up getting canned, which was a shame because it was a proper Nintendo Kirby game.
Right.
It could have been good fun, but just, yeah.
Was that from the Miyamoto visit? What was that like, having Miyamoto in Dundee?
We didn't really know who he was at the time.
Right.
Because it was, early 90s. It's like, he wasn't the huge name everybody knows of him later. He was just, there's a guy coming around and try and wear something neat and we'll be standing behind you for a bit. That's kind of it.
Kid Kirby was one of a number of projects that never saw the light of day, and this was kind of par for the course for studios like DMA back in the mid-90s. Kind of like record companies, studios would often have multiple projects going on at once, taking bets on which one would be a success. With shorter dev time and much less known about consumer behavior in video games, it made sense that some games just didn't take off. But DMA was also suffering from other common growing pains. While some teams within the studio had the right mix of experience and personalities, others didn't. And while a great team didn't always necessarily create a great game, a bad team never did.
You could tell from working with a team whether they had traction and the game was going forward, because that was the first barrier. DMA was famous for actually never finishing things. I'd just come off Uniracers, and Uniracers was a really functional team, and then I went across to work on Kid Kirby, and that was just totally different. That was my first experience of, hang on, I thought game development was like this, but it's like this. So yeah, just personalities involved, the approaches of people. So yeah, when it got canned, in the end, I was not particularly shocked.
At the end of Lemmings 2, I wasn't particularly, because I'd had quite a lot to do with the original Lemmings, and I wasn't really particularly happy with Lemmings 2. We had so many skills in Lemmings 2, it was unbelievable. And we actually discovered at the very end that there was about 10 skills that we hadn't actually used in any levels. We had to just go back in and just go and add them in. I hadn't been particularly happy with the way in which Lemmings 2 had actually been run, and I decided to leave. And that was when I started Visual Science.
After Lemmings up to 95, we grew from those 5 to 10 up to 95 would be in about 50 or so. And then when the GTA stuff kind of got signed with BMG, GTA, Tactics and Clan Wars all got signed. And that was a big deal. I mean, that was a couple million quid's worth of contract. And the company went up to like 130, 140 folk. So we had lots of offices, second building, lots of dev stuff as well. So it grew hugely.
I vaguely remember job interviews, but we were totally making it up as we went along. That's the honest truth of it. Nobody really knew. There was no template you could follow. Nowadays, you've got people who've come through university, they've trained to do video games, they're all fluent in all these software tools. But remember, this was like pre-internet, so nobody could download a tool from a website and figure out how it worked in their own time and then come and use it. We were getting people coming for jobs who literally hadn't touched a computer. Yeah, I think people forget just how pioneering a lot of that stuff was back then, and particularly before the internet. Like when you couldn't just Google something, you literally had to know someone, phone them, wait for a magazine to come out, go to a library in order to find this stuff out. you can't comprehend it now. It's a totally different world.
Alright, you probably noticed the new guy, right? His name is Colin Anderson, and as the keyboards in the background suggest, he was the audio director at DMA for several years. I got his email through somebody else at the company who suggested Colin could speak to the variety of teams that were working at the studio once they expanded after the launch of Lemmings.
So let's set the scene. DMA has now ballooned up to about 100 people and they're working on multiple projects. And while Lemmings had been a success, it had come because of this sort of brainstorming ideation that had come from everyone in the studio. Everyone was sort of like had their paws and fingers in Lemmings to a certain extent. With the studio much bigger and working on loads of different games, that type of creativity, it's not exactly scalable.
On top of that, the studio had had a lot of turnover and new hires. Some teams were functional, while others dysfunctional. And hey, while we're at it, let's throw in the thing that killed more studios in the UK than anything else. The move from computers to consoles, from 2D to 3D. To solve this, the studio broke into different teams and took on a lot of projects over the next era. During the next few years, a 2-game deal with GT Interactive was signed, as was a 4-game deal with BMG Interactive. The next game we're here to talk about is the most notorious of the bunch, even if nobody expected it to be.
So Mike and Russell, who I managed to get a hold of early on, they were also able to speak to Grand Theft Auto, and so was Colin. But at this stage, I really wanted to talk to more people at DMA, people who'd worked on GTA and other games there at the studio. And this is where I started to run into a little bit of trouble, because GTA was a funny team. A lot of them hadn't made a game before GTA, and some of them didn't make one afterwards. And I also wanted to see what it was about the other teams at DMA. What was it about certain teams that made games that were hits and other ones that maybe weren't so much? There's one thing though that was commonplace with everyone I talked to about GTA, is that for all the folks who worked on it, right up until when it was done, nobody thought this was a hit.
Good shot, kid. I think you got him. Good shot, kid. I think you got him.
The original pitch for Grand Theft Auto was a game called Race and Chase, a top-down driving game set in a contemporary city where you could chase cars, play as cops, or be the robbers. In recent years, the original design document for this game has surfaced, but as part of their research for this documentary, our friends at the Video Game History Foundation uncovered a bunch of new assets, including some original sketches from artist Donald Robertson and these 3D pedestrian designs by Stuart Watterson. According to lead artist Ian McHugh, they planned to render out frames from these animated models for the pedestrian sprites, but it never quite worked, and then Stuart left the project, so they ended up hand drawing the sprites in D-Paint instead.
I did the initial prototype for GTA. The game itself was team driven. I mean, the whole design and everything, everybody in the team contributed to the direction of it or whatever. And although Dave took the major decisions to go, okay, it's not going to be cops and robbers anymore, it's just going to be robbers and we'll do this, everything else that made the game really fun and entertaining was suggested by team and implemented by the team. The initial part where I did the graphics engine, so it was this top-down engine. Obviously went through a couple of iterations, but the spinny isometric one first, and then we had the top-down, what we call Lego vision, because it was made out of blocks. That top-down perspective meant you could concentrate on the city and all the things moving within that view and make it busy. The engine itself being top-down allowed GTA to work.
So, you know, for the first few months of its life, it was called Race and Chase, and you were a policeman, and you were trying to clean up the city. But it was only once we actually got a playable kind of prototype, you know, a demo up and running, it became apparent that if you were a policeman, if you were going skidding through the park, knocking pushchairs and buggies out of the way and running over old people and families having picnics, you had to get penalised. Because it didn't make any logical sense. You know, the cognitive dissonance just was vast. So, you know, the decision was made by the team, and the team had autonomy over all of this. Let's get you to play a criminal. Let's see how that feels. And yeah, that was the turning point.
Now, all the people in here are working on what DMA hopes will be its new blockbuster. It's a game called Grand Theft Auto. It's got to be finished by the end of June, so they're involved in some pretty hard work in here. It's all about a car chase through the streets of a fictional, probably American city. Here are some of the maps they've been working on. And Dave here is one of the software designers who's been trying to put it together. Dave, just explain.
One interesting thing that I think a lot of people kind of overlook in this story is the team that did Grand Theft Auto, none of them had made a game before. It was a brand new team. You know, they had all come from different backgrounds, very different previous roles and everything. So this was a first. It grew and evolved. And if one part of the game wasn't working, like the car handling, it was awful.
The initial driving model just didn't work. And then a guy called Pat Kerr came along and says, look, here's something that works.
Pat Kerr, who was a coder who was working on Cobra, which ended up as Wild Out of Country. There was a little prototype of a box, and it was he'd just been messing around with physics handling, and had done some sort of really OTT Hollywood-style crazy skiddy. So this is a beautiful little car that you controlled, and it sort of rear-ended at fishtails, really nice. Like this is getting around, and you're like, oh, this is fantastic to play with. This is brilliant. This needs to go in, and that made, all the difference because the handling was so bad.
And just basically gave this little driving car thing, went into the game, and it was really nice. And that fixed an awful lot of the issues, because part of the GTA is obviously the driving has to feel really good. And the original GTA, it was great fun to drive about.
And there's fantastic things like I don't know if you're aware about the aggressive police in GTA. That's one of the funniest things, where police cars are just so crazy because the car was trying to drive through you, so it's a bug. They weren't meant to be doing what they were doing, and the police car was trying to drive through you because the route finding was messed up. So of course it feels like you're being attacked by a police car. Like, fantastic feeling. So all these lovely little accidents and different people feeding in different things.
I think the other part that really cemented the game was all the radio stations and stuff that went in as well. So Colin Anderson and these musicians, I think 6 of them, did all these kind of full music radio stations. And that was just a huge addition as well.
If you look back at that original design document for GTA, the mention for audio is something like there will be 1 megabyte of RAM available for sound. That's the audio design. So it changed a lot along the way, because we certainly didn't start out with the idea of radio stations, and it wasn't going to be CD based when I started on it. It was going to be there was going to be a floppy disk version of it, so there was no way that we were going to be using CD audio. One of my best days at work ever was when Dave Jones turned up and said they were cancelling the floppy version and it was going to be a CD release only, and I think the N64 version vanished as well. And that was great because suddenly DMA Design had a problem, which was they had a game that looked 2D, even though it had that pseudo top-down 3D thing that when you saw it moving actually looked pretty good, but when you saw it in a screenshot it looked pretty naff. So they had this game that looked like a 2D game on a CD, and no matter how high res you made those textures and maps and whatever, it was never going to come anywhere close to filling that CD. And back then, like, when people paid for a CD game, they expected it to use that technology because CD was cutting edge. So we needed a story that made use of it, and we didn't have one. So I just put my hand up and said, I think I know how we could make use of that CD. And then Craig Connor, who had been working on the game, one day the whole team just turned up, all new starts, and they all sat at their desks, and Craig was on that team. It was just random. He didn't come in to work on that game, he just came in and sat at that desk. If he'd sat at another desk, history would have gone in a completely different way, So I'd given Craig the task of writing kind of 10 or 20 little sketches of music, just tasters of what kind of music could we use in this game, because the premise at that point was still to use a single type of music across the game, because nobody put in different types of music in games at that point. That would have been crazy. And so he sat down and he wrote all these different types of music, some dance, techno, pop, and I just went to review them at his desk one day, and he was playing them, and they were all great. They were all great pieces of music, and I remember thinking, oh, it's a shame we're going to lose, that we're not going to be able to use all these. And without thinking about it, I just said to him, what would be really cool is like if we could get some kind of radio stations in the game where you could play all these different types of music so that you could have all this.
68.2 Dead Fly, 89 FM, Head Radio.
And I wasn't thinking about it at all. It was something. It was an offhand comment. And I would have forgotten all about it except for Craig's face when I said it. I saw Craig's face and his eyes lit up, you know, and that kind of, that might work.
Now this is DMA's music department. As you can see, they do use real instruments here. Let's find out what they've been doing for the Grand Theft Auto project. Craig, what have you been contributing?
I'm working on a radio station at the moment, the hip hop station. There's a variety of different stations in each car that you go into.
Every time you get into a car, you get different music?
Yeah, different station. So this is a hip hop channel that we're in the middle of doing just now.
So you're not just taking it all off a CD, you've actually composed it?
No, everything's composed in-house, yeah.
Amazing amounts of work. We'll let you get on with it.
Right, okay.
If you're interested in learning more about the audio design of GTA and the work that went into creating its various radio stations, check out episode 51 of the NoClip podcast, where we have an extended chat with Colin Anderson. GTA's development was long and difficult, but many at the studio told us that while the production was a bit of a mess, all the extra time they had to finish and polish it was what saved it from being a commercial flop. Brian Baglow was hired as a writer and joined the Grand Theft Auto team at a point where all the game's missions were already completed. His job at the time, to retrofit these missions with stories.
Each of the cities, you could go around wherever you wanted, but the missions were incredibly limited, you know, so your character could run to a building, get in a car, drive a car to another location, get out the car, or drive into a building, come out, jump onto a motorbike, zoom to another point in the city, shoot a guy, and then, you know, take a different car to the docks. And so what happened was the level designers were building that as a series of activities, and I was then backfilling and going, what are we doing? Now that was compounded by the fact that not only was it entirely non-linear, but the only way we could convey information was through a pager that had, as I recall, I think it was 120 characters or 110 characters. It was certainly under Twitter. And so everything had to be done through the pager, and the pager could be triggered by either driving over a specific tile on a map or by picking up a car. So what I did was I ended up going out and basically jotting down every single heist movie, crime caper, you know, crime thriller that I could think of from the last 50 years and going, you know, all the good bits. You know, remember the elevated train chase in The French Connection? Right, that's going in. It's the heist gone wrong from Reservoir Dogs? Yes, I'm having that. And so the whole thing was implied. There was so much in there that you could discover. You know, simply driving down an alley and smashing through some crates and watching them go through to, you know, the kill frenzies with all the little remote control cars and everything. The fact that you know, the more you played, the more aggravated the police got. Your wanted level went up. Realizing that you could take cars through a spray shop and a bomb shop, and, you know, there's all these little things that came together. It rewarded you. The more you played it, the more you explored, the more you experimented, the more stuff you found. You know, so it made you feel like you meant something in the world. You were affecting change.
The missions in GTA, along with the radio stations and size of the city, all contributed to making this game feel a little bit more real than it looked. When you talk about GTA now, people bring up all the controversy in the UK press at the time, but most of this was actually a guerrilla marketing campaign executed by BMG themselves. For the team in Scotland, the violence was nothing more than cartoonish nonsense, just like Lemmings was. And here's another thing Lemmings and Grand Theft Auto shared: a bunch of sprites following each other. The only difference was in Grand Theft Auto, you could run them over.
We always viewed it as Tom and Jerry cartoon humour because it was so distant. You didn't really see it. It was almost Lemming-esque in its kind of death sequence because it was tiny little pixels. So it didn't really matter. You run over them and it was funny. It wasn't that Carmageddon in your face where you see somebody splattered on your screen. We never really viewed it as any kind of issue. I think to prove the point was the Garanga thing, running over the Hare Krishnas. All the scores that add up and everything, it all goes down to that arcade roots that it came from, and all the missions and everything came along later. So that Garanga thing just, you know, it was a multiple kill situation that you would have had in the arcade with spaceships. We just kill them all, and it was the same kind of thing.
1024 in Central mark.
While DMA worked on the PC version of GTA, it was the PlayStation version that brought the game into living rooms all around the world. Russell Kay had left after the development of Lemmings 2 and founded his very own studio, Visual Sciences. But then one day, deep into GTA's development, they got a call.
So DMA had been working on Grand Theft Auto for quite a while. We got a phone call. Initially, it was pitched to us that they were needing a bit of help with the PlayStation 1 version and Sega Saturn, actually. It turned out they didn't have it running on either of them. And to tell you the truth, the team had no technical knowledge as to how they were actually going to do this at all. And we thought we were going to have to ditch some of the game itself to make it fit, but actually we managed to get everything in except for trains. While we didn't have trains that you could get into in the PlayStation 1, we still had trains that just moved around the city, but a player couldn't get into a train. And so we had to cut out one or two missions that were all revolved around trains. I don't know whether or not they kept them into the PC one or if they'd removed that as well. There was a question mark as to whether or not, because there's from memory, there's 3 levels in GTA. We thought we were only going to be able to have 2 to start off with, and that was mainly a time thing, whether or not we were actually going to be able to do it, because we also had to cut down all the graphics palettes. They'd done full color 256 color graphics, and on the PlayStation 1 we could only handle 16 colors per tile. People believed that the police were chasing you around the city. People believed that the pedestrians were walking and they had sort of goals that they were going for. People believed that there was other cars that were moving around and had goals as well as to what they were actually going to do, and that you could follow them and they would be doing particular things, when in reality that was nowhere near what was actually going on in the background.
It's at this point that some familiar names start to appear. Rockstar doesn't promote their developers all that much, and as such, there are only a few names that tend to come up when we talk about their games, and usually for all the wrong reasons. Sam and Dan, the Houser brothers, have a long history of work on the franchise, while producer Leslie Benzies became notorious as a key player due to a 2016 lawsuit. We'll get to Mr. Benzies a little later, but it's at this point that the Housers enter the picture. Sam Houser, son of an actress and wealthy London lawyer, had been working at the record label BMG for a few years when he had the chance to transition to their new interactive initiative. It appears that around this time, Dan, his younger brother of 2 years, wanted to get involved.
At Visual Science, we ended up hosting a team from BMG Interactive on the QA side of things, with one Mr. Dan Houser, as being, he was embedded with us, who just sat with us and it's going to play through the game, and it's going to help us find all the bugs. Sam Houser was just a producer at that point. The DMA guys keep saying that they hardly ever saw Sam, but it's because we had Sam around at our place all the time. I don't know if it was just because his brother was there as on the QA side of things, or if he saw the PlayStation 1 as being the his kind of lead version or what. I don't know exactly, but he was very keen on making sure that we had the PlayStation 1 version. It's kind of looking good. A lot of people played the PlayStation version. I think the PlayStation version was by far and away the most popular one. So I think that there was a generational thing going on there. I tend to find that if you were a child, you played the PlayStation one. You weren't playing the PC one, but dads were playing the PC one.
The other games that were in development were a mishmash of ideas, but many of them shared a similar DNA. A seed you could argue was planted with Lemmings. They were all sandbox games.
Pretty much everything seemed to be moving towards this whole idea of this what's generally called sandbox games these days. And if you've ever been involved in making one of these games, and I've been involved in quite a few of them, including 3 Crackdowns and 2.5 GTAs and so on, they are a nightmare. The company was growing. It was trying to mature, taking on lots of people. It's not, some of these people had zero experience but plenty of talent. In order to try and generate some more money to keep the company going, DMA did a deal with GT Interactive for 2 other titles, Attack and Clan Wars. So Attack was kind of like it was inspired by a Japanese cup noodle advert of all things. As it turns out, Pikmin ended up doing a very similar sort of thing, better. But Attack was like little cavemen that wandered around in a group, and they worked like a little flock, and they sort of attacked dinosaurs and stuff. And Clan Wars was basically CNC with a kind of Scottish vibes. Both of those, again, 2 unique, original, interesting titles.
We never got a chance to play those 2 games, but there were 4 other titles released by DMA Design during this era, and they're all mad. So to help me explain them, I entrusted the help of Brian Baglow, who worked at DMA Design and subsequently was PR manager for Rockstar, to tell you all about Space Station Silicon Valley, Wild Middle Country, Tanktix, and of course, Body Harvest.
So based on the success of Lemmings and some of the earlier games, DMA got signed to the Dream Team, which was the group of developers around the world that Nintendo put together to launch their new console, which was the Nintendo 64. And so they came up with a game called Body Harvest, which was essentially a 3D free-roaming sandbox game in which you played a time-travelling commando who had to go back to various periods in Earth's history and defeat huge insectoid aliens. There were elements of GTA in there because you could wander wherever you want, you could pick up vehicles, you could go into buildings. It also had a sort of a very distinctly cheesy 50s sci-fi theme. It's got a bit of a cult following. I ended up going out to try and pitch the game to Midway because Nintendo kind of stepped back. There was a constant sort of a bit of a battle because they wanted it to be more Metroid. Every time we sent something over to them, they wanted it more family friendly. And in the end, they just kind of went, no.
It was a weird one because it spent so long in development, right? It was about 3 games over its lifetime. I remember many people being on various trips and just going to Japan to speak to Nintendo. It was a really stressful time. That was one of those ones where I was glad to be a few steps removed from it. I'd hated to have been stuck in the front lines. I remember seeing what it did to John, who was lead programmer on it by then. That was hard going.
So Tanktix was, even by the standards of DMA Design, deliciously bonkers, okay? It made no fucking sense. You controlled a giant hovering crane in one of 4 time periods, a dinosaur, a dragon, something else, and a UFO, and you could roam around the landscape. You played it on a PC, so you used the mouse, and you could swoop around the landscape and use your giant magnet to pick up tank parts. Or you could pick up boulders and take them to the Partomatic, which was a big spinning disc somewhere on the landscape, drop boulders in, they would recycle them into tank parts. And you could then also go and pick up sheep and drop them into the hopper and they would turn into tank parts. Or you could drop them onto the treadmill on the outside and it would speed up the production of your tank parts. And your tanks came in tracks and engines and weapons and sensors, and you could put tanks together in any format. So they were modular, you could build them. And then you could go off and play as a real-time strategy game to go and conquer people next to you. What was difficult about that?
It was definitely my favourite of the 4 games that BMG signed. Tanktix was the one I was really excited about. I thought this could be great. Unique selling point was going to be the dynamically created chain with a magnet on the end, and the skill was going to be in using that to pick things up. And unfortunately, it was one of those ideas that sounded much better when somebody described it than when you actually sat down to play it. When you realise that the main thing that your game hinges on isn't working, that's a hard day, because then you've got to go right back to the drawing board and go, right, how are we going to make this work?
So Space Station Silicon Valley was set in a space station which had been lost in space for years, and it was an experimental space station populated entirely by robot animals. All of a sudden it pops back into existence just in the solar system, and so they send up Earth's unlikeliest heroes, Dan Danger and Evo the robot, and they crash into the space station, and Evo is junked, and all that's left is the silicon chip inside his head. You know, he's just a silicon chip, he has no power, so he powers down really quickly, and to survive he has to jump into the different animals. And so you can become all these different animals, but there are different variations on each animal. So you've got a dog, but then the dogs have evolved in different ways. So you had a dog on wheels, which had little rocket packs, so you could have races. There was also a dog with wings and a lovely white scarf and flying goggles, so you could go zooming through the space station. And so you had to basically get through all of these different levels, solve puzzles, get to inaccessible places, hit switches, all the classic platforming mechanics.
The Silicon Valley team were a good team. They definitely knew what they were doing. Good bunch of people. They knew their stuff technically. They were curious, inquisitive, and figured things out as they went. They were pretty productive. And yeah, the game, it was a classic DMA game. How do you market that? And that was always the problem with DMA games, was we just focused on developing something that made us smile and that we loved the idea of. But then when it came to actually communicating that, I do not envy the marketing team at any of the publishers we ever worked with. Yeah, they were a good team. Les started as a programmer. He was lead programmer before he was producer. He took over production later on. It was clear that it needed more production, more hands-on production, and he was brilliant at it. He was just really good at it. And he worked really well with Gary Penn as well. So Gary came in as creative manager, and he helped to sort of focus that project a little bit, as he did with so many of the games that DMA were working on.
They were working on a game called Covert, which was going to be sort of a hunty, sneaky stealth game. Couldn't get it working, so the team kind of flipped and they came up with this open world game, again sandbox, where you played tanks, and the tanks all had different characteristics, different performance, different handling and everything. And you basically had to trundle around the planet, blow shit up and collect power cores. Again, the sound was fantastic. I thought the level design was wonderful. Rockstar published it and it came out on the Dreamcast as Wild Metal, because I think the consensus was that country would make people think it was a country and western game.
All of these games are very different, but they do share one commonality. None of them got a sequel, but just like their greatest hit Lemmings, Grand Theft Auto did.
Soul making, sound shaking, earth quaking, change.
GTA 1 is still my reference point when people talk about the importance or not of polish time, of post-production on projects, because I saw what GTA 1 was like when it was feature complete, technically had everything that it was ever going to have, and it was borderline unplayable. Yet you fast forward 6 months and all you've done is tweak stuff. You've fixed bugs, you've tweaked physics, you've changed bullet velocities, you've improved the audio, you've done all this stuff, and it came alive. The team had been on it for 3.5 years. That was a long time back then in the mid-90s. That was a long, painful development. There was a few people got burnt out. So I think they just wanted to do something very different, and the obvious thing was to change the setting and set it 20 minutes into the future, I think was the phrase. So there was a lot of sort of references of Frank Miller stuff and everything going around, because it was just, right, we need to make this substantially different. I mean, it was a great team. So it was 2 years, and to be honest, that was the biggest challenge. I remember sitting down with the marketing team at Take-Two, and they needed us to commit to a launch date 12 months out. I mean, it was completely unheard of. But the logic was sound, because they said, right, we want to put this in the sand, because by this point the first game had been a success. They wanted to put this marker down and tell everyone else, right, this is when the second Grand Theft Auto game is coming out, so keep your games away from this. This is our date.
It was a worthy successor to GTA 1, I always thought. The difficult part was when we had that 5 minutes into the future design challenge. That was... you get so much design done for free when a game is set in a contemporary. Like, you know how weapons work, you know how cars work. If you don't, you can go and look, you can listen, you can ask. But as soon as you go 5 minutes in the future, it's like, okay, how do these weapons work? So what should they sound like? Should they be lasers or well, not? And it just takes, how do the cars work? Are they electric now? So there's so much more design to do on a game that's not contemporary. And yeah, we learned that big time on GTA 2.
The last sort of 6-9 months were basically just a big long crunch. I mean, no one was chaining us to our desks, but we knew we couldn't knock off at 5 o'clock and get everything done and get the game shippable in a state we wanted. So I can certainly remember one time where I drove everyone home at 7 in the morning because we'd worked through the night. The Goldmaster was due to be Concorded over to New York or something, so we had to meet the Concorde, and it got picked up in a taxi from Dundee, taxied down to Heathrow, and Concorded over to New York. So it's like, yeah, we need to just pull out the stops here, you know. The thing that I liked most about it, that never actually panned out how we'd hoped, but it was the fact that there was no prescriptive mission order. You know, in the first game, you had, certain phones would ring and you had limited choice. You had a little bit of choice what you could do. And obviously between missions, you could go off on tangents. What we tried to do with the second game was really open that up, and depending on how you sort of favoured with the different gangs, you were taking different missions. So we wanted you, the player, to be much more in control.
Job complete.
And we understood the gameplay a bit better by that point. So yeah, I think it was a richer environment, richer set of missions. Most of the design decisions were made with the whole team. That we basically evolved the game on the fly, and I think it was every Wednesday morning I would just go down to the team room and we'd all get around the whiteboard and go, right, and we would just brainstorm stuff. So some of that would be vehicles, what's some of the functionality that the designers need to build into the mission structure. Kind of got done by committee, which was great in terms of getting the team bought in, but it was just a very different structure to how you develop games now, where ultimately it's a much smaller group responsible for making sure it's tight and focused. But it did mean everyone was bought in, because it was all group decisions on what could and couldn't make it in.
In the city, respect is everything.
Intro to the game was like a sort of a super cutted version of this movie thing that was used for marketing, right?
We were aware there was the intro movie getting cut. We weren't really involved. I remember us all being really impressed with it, so there was no problems. But no, we weren't really involved. Whereas on the first game, I think there was a promo video shot, and the dev team went out and drove around Dundee and were hanging out of windows shooting fake guns down at the docks in Dundee and stuff. I don't know if that video still exists, but GTA was now big enough that we weren't going to get away with doing that again.
That makes sense that you weren't involved, because it always seemed a bit like sort of incongruous as well. Like that was sort of a contemporary New York, clearly gangster type thing, but it felt different to the retro futuristic stuff.
Yeah, well, the publishing and the marketing was all done at New York. The picture, the cover art was taken from the top of the Empire State Building, just looking down. To this day, everyone thinks the game is developed in the States. It's just because it's got that vibe, and because there's not, in the scheme of things, that big a deal ever made about it being something that comes out of Scotland.
History records Grand Theft Auto 3 as the final game from DMA Design, but in truth it was GTA 2 where this story ends. DMA had been passed from pillar to post over the late years. Just before the release of 2, Dave Jones sold DMA Design to Gremlin Interactive for £1 sterling and around £2 million in debt. And just after GTA 2 launched, Gremlin were in turn acquired by the French publisher Infogrames. But family-friendly Infogrames were concerned about the negative publicity Grand Theft Auto may attract to them. So they looked to offload the studio pretty quickly. This is when Take-Two Interactive, who wanted Grand Theft Auto, bought DMA and made it part of their new label, Rockstar Games, which was being headed by two brothers recently hired from BMG Interactive. Early copies of Grand Theft Auto 3 have the DMA logo on the back of the box, while later copies would feature the studio's new name, Rockstar North. But from all the people we talked to, the truth is that DMA came to an end when the studio moved from their native Dundee to set up shop in Scotland's capital, Edinburgh. This is where Rockstar North still calls home.
This is where many of our interviewees decided to part ways with the company for one reason or another. Some of them had simply just crunched on GTA 2 really hard and needed a change. Others still cited Take-Two's corporate culture. They didn't really vibe with how self-serious it was and they wanted to do something else. Others still just didn't want to move to Edinburgh. But some of them did work in the early stages of Grand Theft Auto 3, so I was hoping they'd be able to answer the question that has been bugging me since we started this. Who was it that stuck around? Who were the people who were there in the story of DMA that shepherded Grand Theft Auto into this new era?
So the Silicon Valley team was superb. So you had the core of that team was Les, who was the coder, and he was kind of looking after the team. There was Obi. Obi was fantastic. He was a really sharp coder. And then Aaron Garbett, who was the artist, very creative. And they were kind of the core of that team. And they became the core of the GTA team, so GTA 3 team. And they were a really good, tight, effective unit, really good at getting things done, which was the best thing about it. And they also had a really good game feel. They really understood, the importance of how things should feel. I think it was Les's belief in himself and Obi and Aaron that they would get these, they would be able to make this game properly 3D.
It was essentially the Silicon Valley team that took over GTA and became the GTA 3 team at that point. So the Silicon Valley team, to my mind, were the team that really took it and ran with it. But the way I always looked at it was, it took the whole of DMA Design and every game that DMA Design ever made to make GTA 3. Because when you look at what it became, it had bits of Body Harvest in it, the open world vehicle 3D thing, or they'd already encountered and attempted to solve the design for how you structure missions in 3D open world landscapes. Same with Silicon Valley as well, they'd already done that. But then the physics part of GTA 3 came from Wild Metal Country, because I think it was Bill Henderson was working on the physics. Like, Wild Metal Country was really heavy on the physics. It felt like no one team within DMA on its own could have made GTA 3. The only reason GTA 3 happened was we had a great team who were really good at focusing and producing and organizing, that had all this support around them from all these other projects that we'd learned hard lessons from. There were just a lot of people who didn't know how to make games to begin with, because we were hiring people who had never made games. But by that time, in 99, 2000, we had people who had made and released games and they knew what to do. And then it was a case of getting the right people together to lead certain parts. Yeah, I don't think the GTA 1 team could have made GTA 3, and I don't think the Silicon Valley team could have made GTA 3. To me, it took DMA Design as it was then, the whole of it. To my mind, it was that institutional learning from the whole way through, and all the mistakes that had been made on all the projects that culminated into that one thing and really got that one over the fence. Like, the commercial success of it is almost by the by, but just the technical, what it became was incredible. fantastic to think that DMA ever produced a game as good as that.
Hey, so this documentary was done, and then I got an email from somebody important, who was like, I worked on a bunch of these games at DMA, and I worked at Rockstar. If you have any questions, let me know. It's the finished doc behind me. So this is about as late an 11th hour interview as I've ever done. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, there we go. Not too bad. How are you keeping?
All right. Good
Thanks.
to talk to you. Let me just say that I'm actually a quite big fan of your series. I think your videos are amazing.
Wow, thank you so much. That means a lot. Whenever we hear like people who actually make games, especially, you know, some of the best games ever, watch our stuff, it's like the most humbling thing in the world. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's always fun to talk about the good old days at Dundee. So, anytime.
So what are your, strongest memories of your time working on Space Station Silicon Valley then?
It's really just the camaraderie. It was a small team with just 10 people. So 4 coders, maybe 3 artists, 3 level designers, something like that for most of the time. Grew a little bit at the end. And, we do everything together, like typically go out drinking on Wednesdays and then again on Fridays, just with the team or with the company. There wasn't a design document that we had to strictly follow. But because everybody talked to each other in the team, it all worked out in the end. You feel like you can criticize other people and you can take criticism from other people. That's half the battle, because then you can have an open discussion. Everybody listened to everybody. It was just really fun to work that way. So we finished Space Station Silicon Valley in 99. I guess it was late 98, I guess. And in 99, they set up another office in Edinburgh, because basically there was quite a few people like me that didn't really love Dundee. I mean, it was fun to work there for a while, but it's, couldn't see ourselves starting a family there. So they set up an office in Edinburgh, which is just an hour up the road. And I volunteered for it, and most of the Silicon Valley team went there straight away. But it wasn't really a plan for what we're going to do. We just went there, and then we kind of sat there. I was like, okay, now what do we do? So what ended up happening is everybody started doing their own project. So it was Leslie and Aaron that said, well, why don't we work on GTA 3? Because, GTA 1 was such a great hit. GTA 2 didn't do so well, but we can take it into 3D, and, they could see that's going to go somewhere. So they started doing that, and literally within 2 weeks, like everybody just went, yeah, this is a great idea. So everybody sort of teamed up, and we started doing it. And in fact, it didn't really come from management, didn't come from New York. They just kind of let us do it for a bit. And then after maybe 4 or 5 months, they went, well, this looks pretty good. So yeah, okay, carry on, just do what you're doing. Whereas before, it sounded like they were actually planning to give it to another company altogether, because, GTA 2 wasn't really working out that well. But at that point, they just kind of went, okay, fine, we do GTA 3.
You came the wrong way, huh?
Leslie Benzies did make a design document with everything spec'd out, like the weapons and the sort of type of vehicles we have. But basically, I think everybody was pretty confident that it was just going to be, GTA 1 in 3D. There's some things that didn't really work that well. In GTA 1, they had like a lot of the missions you took through phone calls. That was really not something that we felt would translate that well to 3D. It was kind of weird to answer the phone everywhere. So we sort of ditched that idea. But I mean, these are all minor tweaks. I mean, the gameplay was just great. It was just a matter of making it 3D. And of course, 3D gives you more opportunities too. All of a sudden, the weapons are more interesting. So you can have blow up this truck, and there's multiple ways of doing it with a rocket launcher and the grenades or whatever. So, sniper rifle doesn't really work in 2D, but it works in 3D. So it just led to more interesting missions just because it was in 3D. Now it was about 25 people. So basically the Space Station Silicon Valley team plus a few other people that had finished their projects, and maybe some new hires. But it was still the same. We'd still sort of go out together and stuff. But it was just incredibly hard work. In fact, it was a lot shorter than Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was about 3.5 years maybe, and GTA was just 2.5 maybe. Not as crazy as Vice City though, because that was just 1 year. In that year, we also did the PC version of GTA 3. So that year, it was a bit much. But GTA 3 was fine. Yeah, it was just fun.
Okay, so you're saying that like 25 people over the course of like 2.5 years made like the first open world city game, and your enduring memory was that it was a good laugh.
It was a good laugh, yeah. And it was still time for, it is Scotland. It was still time to get pissed twice a week, so it was all good.
1024 in South Market.
From my conversations with the early DMA folks, I'd come to understand that on the first 2 Grand Theft Auto games, Sam Houser had more of an A&R or producer style role for the publisher BMG, while Dan did some Q&A work on the first game and had written the second game's intro from Rockstar's offices in New York. This office founded in 1998 when Take-Two started Rockstar after the acquisition of BMG Interactive. Dan has a writing credit on Grand Theft Auto 3, while Sam an executive producer credit. So I guess I wanted to know how involved the New York Rockstar office was in the development of Grand Theft Auto 3. And ultimately, what was work like under corporate ownership, especially for a bunch of folks who had worked at DMA?
They were pretty much hands off with GTA 3, I would say. It was really up to us. And the game was completely designed around the missions. Like, people would come up and say, oh, this would be a cool idea. Maybe we try this. And we tried it, and if it was fun, yep, that's in. If it was not fun, it's out. Nothing to do with the story, basically. And then it was up to the story writers to... But it wasn't really a story. It's like you meet a character, you do 5 missions, you meet another character. In the later games, New York sort of got more involved and took more charge of it. And they had their ideas about how the story would be playing out, and the characters were more important. But at GTA 3, there was very little of that. It was mostly wrapping a thin story around the missions, really. Doing small games are like really fun because there's only so many people, so every person has like a lot of responsibility. So I can look at GTA 3 and say, oh, I did that, I did, whatever, the clouds, the vehicle AI, I can make a long list of things. But then as we moved along, like got more programmers, more artists, so everybody did a smaller piece. So at the end, I only did like a little bit. So it's just way more fun to work on smaller projects. And after GTA 4, that for me was a little too big a project.
What's your memory of DMA? Do you think DMA came with you as well to Edinburgh, that it was still DMA during GTA 3? And what is your sort of like memory of what DMA was, I guess, as opposed to what Rockstar North was?
I don't think of it as the same company. No, I think DMA stayed in Dundee, and it sort of slowly dissipated into other companies and all the people that work there still. I think Dave Jones had a lot to do with it. I think the freedom had a lot to do with it. So yeah, no, it just became different. It became more corporate, and not in a bad way, but more focused and more sort of single track. Whereas in DMA it was all, it was chaos. It was like interesting projects being cancelled, new projects being started all the time. That just disappeared. So no, DMA was something that happened from 85 till 99, and then it's sort of, as far as I'm concerned, it just kind of went away.
When I started this project, I wanted to celebrate the legacy of DMA Design, and obviously what I thought that was celebrating all the games they made and ultimately the one franchise that took over the world. But from talking to all of these people, the folks you've seen and others I've talked to privately or over email, there's another legacy here, a really important one. It's not just the games that they made, but it's the place they made them.
Since the closing of DMA Design, the city of Dundee would go on to become one of game development's most influential cities. Not just the many games that were made here, but pioneering innovations in education, technology, and entertainment. Inspired by a handful of local boys who made some of the biggest games in the world, Dundee would go on to embrace video games as an industry that everybody could be a part of, which is why today a city in Scotland with a population just shy of 150,000 people is recognised as one of the most important video game hubs in the world.
Way back in the mid-90s, Scotland had 6 development studios. DMA was the one that they did Lemmings, and Lemmings was one of the very first superstar breakout international smashes, 22 platforms, millions of sales. And that's still fondly remembered. There are pubs in Dundee that are decorated with Lemmings on every surface. I would argue that the fact that DMA was there and visual science really helped directly inspire Abertay University to go, hang on, maybe there's something that we could be teaching them this whole game thing. And they did. They created the world's first video game development degree. Dundee remains the beating heart of Scotland's games scene. You know, around about 50% of all the development in Scotland is in and around Dundee. Dundee has reinvented itself. It used to be known for juke jam and journalism, you know, so it was an industrial city. Before that, it was a shipping, whaling, you know, port city. But it's now, you know, the waterfront is a place of culture and creativity. And not only have we got the V&A Museum right on the waterfront, it's now getting a 4,000-seat e-sport arena. One of the first in the whole of the UK. So it's continuing to innovate and pioneer, and it's still inspiring people across the whole of the country. You know, we made Grand Theft Auto, we continue to make Grand Theft Auto. It happened here, it could happen to you. You can do it as well.
Proceed to 1024 and South Park.